Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for August 6, 2025. This should be a day of solemn remembrance because it was 80 years ago today that the U.S. dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The results were 80,000 people died instantly. During the next 2 to 4 months, there were between 90,000 and 166,000 more who died from the after effects of the bombing, the burns, the radiation, and so on. And the city was leveled. At 11 a.m. today, Eastern Time, Helga Zepp-LaRouche will have a dialogue with Dr. Akiko Mikamo, who's the author of a book, 815, A True Story of Survival and Forgiveness from Hiroshima. This is a riveting non-fiction account of the devastation unleashed on Hiroshima, based on the story of her father's miraculous survival and his journey of reconciliation and forgiveness. There'll be a link in the description section to this dialogue. This again is at 11 a.m. Eastern Time and 5 p.m. Central Time. Now, this should be a compelling, desperately needed reminder of the horrors of modern warfare and the danger of today's war hawks who are involved in pushing for provocation of Russia and China and Iran, which could lead to nuclear war today. Now, it shouldn't be required, but it is, because of the corruption of the media, the corruption of the academic world, and the control by the imperial war hawks of the narrative. Now, we'll have, in addition to the link to the dialogue, I have a link to Lyndon LaRouche's report on the truth about the decision to use nuclear weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also a link to the June 10th post on X by Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard on her recent visit to Hiroshima. Now, just for a second, let me go through what LaRouche wrote in his 1994 article, because this is the real history that most people don't know. He reports that the Emperor of Japan was already in negotiations with the United States to end the war, and that means that the Truman administration was lying when it said that the bombing saved 1 million American lives by eliminating the need to invade Tokyo. Well, the negotiations for surrender were already there. It was being done through channels, including the Vatican. But Truman, who had just come to the presidency with the death of Franklin Roosevelt, acted on British direction. Now, what was the British policy? Well, they were intending to extend World War II, to stay in a mobilized state, and preparing for a preemptive nuclear war against their wartime ally, the Soviet Union. And this was part of a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia. And it was the plan for a post-war order in which British global liberal imperialism would dominate the planet. And of course, the United States would be a supporting ally of that. Now, the evidence for this is clear. There were two leading proponents of this plan. One was the so-called peacenik philosopher Bertrand Russell, who in fact, in this period after World War II, drafted a proposal for using the monopoly of nuclear weapons that existed with the United States to launch preemptive strikes against the Soviet Union. There's also a war plan that was drafted for Churchill called Operation Unthinkable, which was to, again, use the immediate post-war period and the mobilization of forces in the West to defeat the Soviet Union and bring it under the control of a British liberal imperial order. Now, this is still the intent of the oligarchy today. This is what's behind the provocations in Ukraine, the support for the Israeli genocide in Gaza and the West Bank, the preparation for a war against China. This is still the intent of the oligarchy of the City of London. to establish a global order that would be centered in the financial districts of the City of London, as well as with the European Union, NATO, and the United States, in which this imperial center would rule over a world of subservient states lacking sovereignty. Now, how do we see this functioning today? You have the so-called E3, the European three, France, Germany, and Starmer's Britain, preparing to engage in a NATO war against Russia, as they say, by as early as 2027. And they're talking about a €1 trillion defense budget on countries that are currently undergoing deindustrialization and infrastructure collapse. Now, this is partly behind what the lunatic Boris Johnson did on August 4th when he delivered a speech in Taiwan. And what did he say? He praised what he called the shift by Donald Trump against Putin and against Russia. And what he said is that the use of sanctions against India and China will cut off support for Russia, which is what his intent has been from the beginning. Now remember, Boris Johnson was the messenger sent by NATO in April 2022 to tell Zelensky to tear up the draft treaty that had been negotiated between Russia and Ukraine. And Johnson is essentially portrayed by himself as a Churchillian figure. And so it's not surprising that he would be at the forefront of this Churchillian provocation and preparation for war. So with this background, there should be no surprise at all of the censorship of what has been brought out by Tulsi Gabbard's office about the real story of Russiagate. That the Russiagate operation was a fraud concocted and run by U.S. intelligence networks, especially those of the Obama administration's CIA leader Brennan and Director of National Intelligence Clapper, to undermine any potential that Trump might have for negotiating a normalization of relations between the United States and Russia. Now, that story is being ridiculed by the same people who have lied for years now, 10 years now, about the so-called Russian collusion with Trump or the Russian plan of Putin to disrupt the U.S. election in 2016. And the declassified documents that Gabbard has released demonstrate the collusion of the war criminals in the United States in putting out this fake story. But the full story is now going to be available, the full story of the fraud of Russiagate, thanks to a white paper that's been produced by myself and several of my colleagues, Diane Sayre, Dennis Speed, and Carl Osgood, and David Shaven, which is a team that put together a report titled Worse Than Treason, the Actual Motive Behind Russiagate. And that will also be linked in the description box. What the story that we're telling is, again, the story that still hasn't been told. It has appeared to some extent in some of the press, including the British press. The Guardian covered it. But the first story of Russian collusion, Russian intervention in the U.S. election came from the head of the Cyber Intelligence Division of the British government, the GCHQ, Robert Hannigan, who in June of 2015, even before Trump announced his presidential campaign, Hannigan was warning of signals that there were Russian intelligence operations aimed at the U.S. election. A year later, he went to Washington and gave this report to Brennan, who used it in conjunction with the FBI, with Clapper and others, to begin the story of Russian collusion with Trump. This has been discredited. Mueller couldn't prove it. The documents that Gabbard are releasing show that the intelligence communities that were cited as supporting it had low confidence in the reports of Russian hacking and Russian intervention. And yet the story still became the dominant story of the first term of the Trump administration. And it was especially important after Trump announced after his meeting with Putin in Helsinki that he had more confidence in the material, the intelligence coming from Russia, than he did from his own intelligence community. And don't forget, it was Schumer who said, don't go against the U.S. intelligence community. They have 6 ways from Sunday of getting you. Well, that's what they did. And the fact that there was a British hand behind it has not been reported. So this is now available in the white paper that we've produced that should be distributed, because this is where the investigation by Tulsi Gabbard should go. The nuclear war hawks, the ones who are pushing to the point of a confrontation between the U.S. and Russia, which would have devastating consequences on the world. These are people who are still being directed by the City of London and the nations of the West, which are heading toward bankruptcy, the dollar collapse, the deindustrialization, the green transformation, unprepared for a war that they're about to provoke with Russia. So please watch the dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche and Dr. Mikamo today at 11 a.m. Eastern. It will be archived so you can get it later at the LaRouche Organization site. And look at the documents that are linked in the description box. Ignorance now is no excuse. We've put together the story. It's irrefutable. So the question is, are there enough people with the courage to take on this bankrupt establishment, which is responsible for millions of deaths since the period of World War II? So thanks for joining me today, and please